Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, it's our trade deadline preview. Who's staying, who's going, and what do the Mets need to add? Of course, we make new scoreboard predictions and answer your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, a big week on tap because I think it's finally that time of year. We're going to get more rumors. We're going to see some big decisions made of buying and selling, especially with this giant wild card pool in the National League. It's going to be a fun one. How are we feeling?
I'm feeling ready for the deadline. 8 days from here when we record, the trade deadline will be here, and things could start moving this week. Everything doesn't always wait until deadline day or the day before deadline day, so there could be some activity throughout the league as we get through this week, which is obviously exciting.
Right before we get there, let's briefly recap the week that was, because with the All-Star festivities, there hasn't been a lot of action since our last episode of the Mets Pod. And of course, when you look at this team, it's just the Marlins are just a little thorn in their side. The Mets have been a very streaky team throughout this year as a whole, but the Marlins have been that team in the division that everybody else has seemed to kind of clean up on. Meanwhile, the Mets just tread around 500 against them as we sit here today, below 500 against them. It felt like one where, especially when they play at Miami, Joe, they just let games get away. And I think the story so far, because even the win they had, which was 1-0, the offense looks a little cold out of the break so far.
It's really annoying. I mean, it's been this way forever. It's not just a now thing. Miami, the Marlins have always been a thorn in the Mets side. It doesn't matter how good the Mets are, how bad the Mets are. They just seem to struggle against Miami. And yeah, it's been a little cold out of the break for them. But if they can go ahead and split, you're not happy with it, but you just take it and move on to the Yankee series and, just hopefully get a break from the Marlins for a little bit. I don't know the schedule when they face them next, but I could stand to just not face the Marlins for a while.
Yeah, everybody looks at the Marlins on their schedule and goes, oh, okay, this is where things will get easy.
And the Mets are like, no.
Yeah, it seems to be their kryptonite. And, oddly enough, as I said, the offense has gotten cold. In the 2 losses they had in this series so far, they did have 8 hits in those games, but it's the timely hits, Joe. It's the lack of power, it feels like. And I think when you look at who the Marlins trot out there on the mound, while those guys have had some success against the Mets this year, they've really struggled league-wide as well. So a little frustrating, of course. And when you look at it, this is a Mets team that when they were at their best, it felt like they were getting a little bit from everyone. And right now it feels like they're just a little slow out of the break. On the other side of things, in terms of reinforcements, Kodai Senga, what we think is his final rehab start, it was a little rough in Syracuse. It sounds like he really couldn't locate that ghost fork for the most part, but physically it sounds like he feels well. It felt like the rehab appearances before this went very, very smoothly, Joe. It's not confirmed necessarily when he'll be back, although the manager, Carlos Mendoza, has hinted at the series against Atlanta. What do you think it is with Senga right now? Is this just kind of shaking the rust off after being down for, let's be honest, month after month after month? This was not a brief absence from the mound.
It's spring training. It is his spring training. So if we were in Port St. Lucie in March and he gave up 5 runs, we wouldn't be sounding the alarms necessarily. But because it's July and coming up on August, you want him to obviously be in top shape coming in. The ghost fork, like you said, he was struggling to locate it. And he said he was trying some things. So I think he's just making sure he's right when he gets back. And ultimately, the results in a rehab start don't actually matter. It's just you want to get to that pitch count where you could bring him in and be confident you could throw him 85, 90 pitches. Because if it's not that number, then there's no reason to have him here quite yet. Like you said, it hasn't been confirmed. And who knows, maybe they pivot and say, we'd rather do one more rehab start and hopefully he gets better results and then we bring him up. But I'd be perfectly fine bringing him in the series against Atlanta this weekend, even off that rough start in Syracuse. I don't think that would be at all indicative of what I would expect from him in his first start back. But whether it's this weekend, next week, it is pretty cool to say that Kodai Senga is finally making his way back to Citi Field and to the Mets rotation here in the near future.
Yeah, this rotation has missed having that front man. They've gotten, plenty of productive outings from, it feels like, the middle of the rotation, whether it's Severino, Minaya, and Quintana have kind of run hot and cold. But for the most part, the Mets have just been lacking that true number one guy, what people like to call a stopper. Let's get into the trade deadline, because it feels like that's why, what people are into right now, what they're anticipating, what everybody's anxious for. Joe, from my view, this feels like a deadline that might be lacking everybody chasing a big star. Even last year, we didn't know until pretty late that the Angels were going to actually go for it and not trade Shohei Ohtani. And when you look at, and the same could be said about a guy like Juan Soto and on and on and on. It feels like this is a deadline that is more teams are looking for pitchers, because they always are, both relief help and starters. But I don't know if there's a big supply, Joe. And maybe some of that is because of, as I opened with, how wide this pool is of National League teams that are legitimately contending for one of the final wildcard spots. And then a part of it, too, is you just have to look at it. To surrender pitching right now, you need to get an overwhelming return. And it's not that teams aren't willing to pay. It's that there's only a handful of teams that can actually afford those prices by what their farm system has.
Yeah, I think this week, probably midweek or so, some of those teams that are on the border will have to make a decision as to, are we going to sell some things or are we going to add? It doesn't look like it's going to be particularly a star-studded deadline, to your point. I think Garrett Crochet could move from the White Sox, who he's been fantastic, but I don't think anyone would confuse Garrett Crochet with, a star in the sport. Luis Robert at Chicago as well is a possibility. But it looks like it's going to be a lot of some starters. There's always a supply of relievers. I know there's a lot of people on Twitter that are like, there's not enough supply of relievers at the deadline. Mets are going to have to crazy overpay. And, if you want someone good, you're probably going to have to give up a pretty good prospect to get it. But I think as we progress throughout this week, more relievers are going to come available, because any team that decides they're going to be sellers, they have to have a reliever or two that are useful that some team could use. So I think the reliever market will end up flush as usual. And it's just going to be a deadline lacking in that star, like you said, Juan Soto. Even if you want to talk last year, you mentioned things that kind of ended up happening really late. The Scherzer and Verlander stuff. I mean, if we did our show a week out from the deadline last year, we considered it unlikely that Scherzer or Verlander would move, and they both moved days later. So there's still room for things to flip, and I suspect they will by like midweek or so.
Yeah, and then you look at the teams that they think they're maybe a year away, despite them overachieving, like the Nationals. Why not trade your rentals, right? Jesse Winker, most likely going to be on the move because he's having a really good year. They can get something for him now. They're not going to bring him back next year with all the young players they have coming up. Those are the types of pieces that you'll see moved. And Joe, you headlined it with Crochet, understandably so. He's probably the best available pitcher on the market, we would think. That's realistic, right? We've seen Scooble's name out there. That seems wild.
That would be surprising.
That would be really surprising to me as well. That's just a young ace for a team that they've been building it for a while. With the White Sox, they've kind of treaded nowhere for a while, that you could see, as much as Crochet is young. Why I'm fascinated about that one, Joe, yes, he was an all-star. Yes, he's 25 years old. He's thrown over 107 innings so far this year. Last year, he threw 12. The year before that, he didn't pitch. He was hurt. The year before that, he threw 54. Like, we're reaching territory. Are you going to go give up 3 of your top prospects for a guy that might have an innings limit in the stretch run? I'm not guaranteeing that. I'm just saying it's real.
No, he is going to have an innings limit. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Crochet over the last week or two, and that teams are looking at him as a reliever for the rest of this year and a starter for 2025. Like, that's how teams, like the Dodgers or someone like that, they'll be like, You come in and you could be an impact late inning reliever for us, which, by the way, in college, he was a reliever.
Okay.
He started his pro career as a reliever, and the White Sox converted him to a starter. And he's obviously been incredibly successful. And I think teams do believe going forward he is a starter. But to your point about the injury, I don't know if it was Tommy John. I think it was. But either way, he missed a lot of time with an injury. And, the limited innings, I think, indicate that this year he's probably going to spend most of the second half in the bullpen with someone. And then, obviously next year he can trot back out as a starter with a little bit more of a normal innings count.
And that's the question that teams face, right? Is being a buyer, but what are you buying, right? Because I brought up Jesse Winker earlier, and that's just an example of a pure rental, right? Okay, what is this guy going to give us the last 2 months here as probably a platoon hitter? And then you look at Crochet. Yes, there is short-term questions, like you said, Joe, but long-term, he's not a free agent until 2027. And this guy was the 11th overall pick in his draft. So you're getting somebody cost-controlled that can be a huge part of your future. And I think that kind of takes us to the Mets here, Joe, where it's going to be fascinating to see ultimately how Stearns plays this, because we know they need at least one reliever. You could definitely make a strong case they need two relievers, and we'll get to actual position players here in a moment. And the question is, how do you balance the line of going out and getting, look at Phil Maton, right? They essentially, it seems like we're mostly paying money for a guy that it wasn't working out with the Rays, but there was a clear sample size of him having success as a major league reliever. And we'll kind of see where it goes from there. But do you go out and look for guys with team control? Like when they traded for Brooks Raley, when they traded for Brooks Raley, and I understand that was a winter, not a trade deadline, the thought of Brooks Raley was, we're going to go pay up to get him because we think he could be our setup man for the next 3 years. And before he got hurt, Brooks Raley was a massive part of this bullpen. Or if you're the Mets, Joe, are you looking to spend as little as possible and take a flyer on rental relief arms? That's the interesting line that I think we are pretty convinced he's going to add to this bullpen. I think that question has personally been answered. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's a question of what kind of arm are you adding?
I would think it's a balance of the two. I'd be surprised personally if they went to the top of the market for the Tanner
Miller.
Scotts or Mason Miller even. Mason Miller, I don't think he's going to be dealt. And frankly, the cost that Oakland would ask, I don't think anyone should pay it either. As good as he is and as long as he's under control, I mean, he's at the end of the day still a reliever.
Like Edwin Diaz kind of cost?
At least.
Right, I think so too.
Maybe even more, because it was 5 years. It's 5 years plus of control on the guy. Yeah. So I don't expect Mason Miller to be dealt. But hey, if someone wants to pay the piper, then maybe Oakland listens. Even when you think about a Tanner Scott who's a rental, I think that prospect cost may even end up too much for the Mets. So I would expect, and David Stearns, I know it hasn't worked out.
Should have traded for him 3 days ago.
Yeah, I know, right? I would say historically, and I know this is going to make some Mets fans roll their eyes because the bullpen's been a struggle this season. Historically, David Stearns has built fantastic bullpens, and he knows generally what to look for. So I trust him here to find the right guy or two, and I would guess there might be one that a pretty solid prospect is a part of, and maybe one where you're taking money, whether that's taking an outfielder, we'll get into that in a second, but maybe you take an outfielder that makes money to lessen the cost for some reliever you think has some promise to help out in the second half. But they certainly need to add to this bullpen, and whether that's one or two relievers, of course, Sean Reed Foley is on the mend, working his way back. Reed Garrett should eventually be back. Whatever you think of those guys. So I think there will be some activity in the bullpen. It's just a matter of towing that line of aggressiveness.
Yeah, and we brought up Scott, who it feels like the Mets before this weekend do really well against, but Tanner Scott league wide, I mean, he's really had a turning point in his career. Last year, a 2.31 ERA. Somebody that he only had 12 saves technically, but he finished 26 games. This year, he's already got 16 saves. He's got a 1.27 ERA. His strikeouts are always, in the double digits over 9. It's always been the walks with him. That's always been Scott's question. And last year he had a career low in walks over 9. This year it's been a little bit of an issue at times again. But I'm with you, Joe. It's going to be expensive for a player like that. That is absolutely a true rental. He will head to free agency this winter, and if he finishes this season strong, wherever that's going to be, and it will not be with the Marlins, as a 30-year-old free agent closer, he's going to get a lot of money, and that he's going to cost a lot on the trade deadline, even for a rental. So I like your idea of finding a way to lower the cost by using financial muscle. It is a theme of this show. It always has been, because you look at the advantages of having probably the richest owner in the sport in terms of actual spending, pretty comfortably. That's a way you do it. And we've seen the Mets operate this way, where they go and try to get guys for free. And for free, I mean, they don't actual cost baseball assets, whether it's, young
Trevor Gott last year.
Last year, which it didn't work. But the idea
right.
is a well-calculated idea, because if you're one of the only teams in baseball that can operate that way, it's risk-free, essentially.
Right.
So I like that strategy here. Let's kind of pivot it to the outfield, because this is a spot where I think this is really interesting, Joe. Like, I walk out of the deadline, and I think the Mets are going to add a reliever or two, and most likely I'll shrug and be like, let's see how this goes. I don't think it'll be an 8th inning surefire guy. I don't think it'll be a scrap heap player that we don't care about. It'll just be relievers. There's so much volatility that we'll see how it goes, but they're going to make a move. With the outfield situation, it's pretty easy to say that they should go get a rental here, but there are some interesting variables where Starling Marte, it sounds like things are trending in a positive direction. But to me, Joe, and I know you probably agree with this, with the struggles of DJ Stewart, who they just keep plugging into the middle of the lineup, it feels like, just hoping this will turn at some point. They need a left-handed bat, it feels like, in this outfield. It's funny, I opened the show with Jesse Winker, who Met fans know all too well. That is the perfect example of one, but there's plenty that go around at the market like this. It feels like this team has to try something with a left-handed outfield bat, Joe.
I agree, and Jesse Winker is actually a really good fit, depending on what it'll cost. And it'd be very fun based on obviously all the history between Winker and the Mets fans. And I think he's always had love for Met fans. I've seen him do some interviews where
it's
he
in good
talked about that. Yeah, it's all in good fun. So I would sign up for Jesse Winker to be a Met here for a couple of months. And while Starling Marte is on the mend, I don't think it's imminent by any means. I think he hit off a tee and played catch. So he's got a ways to go. And in a perfect world, which we all know this stuff never ends up being a perfect world, and Marte comes back, Nimmo and Bader are still doing their thing healthy, having a good left-handed bat off the bench is something that is valuable regardless. But the way DJ Stewart has, played since May or so, it probably shouldn't be overly difficult to get an improvement upon DJ Stewart. And what's important with him is he does have a minor league option remaining. So if you do acquire someone, you can always option DJ Stewart to AAA and keep him as depth in the organization. But I would be very much on the hunt for an outfielder, ideally a left-handed hitting one. And if the worst case scenario is you become very deep at outfield where you have Nimmo, Bader, Marte, call it Winker or someone of his ilk, and then Tyrone Taylor as your 5th outfielder, I think
ideal.
you're then in a very good spot.
I agree with you. And what we have to keep in mind with Marte, we are at the point of his career that his body needs to be managed in a way that, you're a Cowboys fan, right? How many years did you hear of Tyron Smith not practicing? We're at the point with Marte where we're on that point of a management plan that, hey, if JD needs a day off, Marte can DH at that point. Marte might go out and give you 5 innings in right field against a left-handed pitcher. But then when the bullpen comes in, you probably we'll just keep using Winker as the example, that player, that left-handed outfield bat. Marte was struggling to move in the outfield. He's still a great bat. There's no denying that. But even if your medical staff is projecting his return at a manageable pace that will help you this season, what that actual help is on a day-by-day basis is not the Starling Marte of 2 or 3 years ago. So That's going to be really important for them to weigh as well. And I like that you brought up Stewart with the options. That's a really, really key point. It makes their decision almost too easy. So, Joe, everybody loves to talk about the players that the Mets could acquire. And we know this is a regime under Stearns that we've said it over and over again. They're not just offering up Ryan Clifford, right? Jet Williams, Drew Gilbert, like the top prospects in this system, Brandon Sproat. It's a non-starter. Who are the actual prospect names? And I know it's a wide pool when you get into the names that are 10 to 30 or 10 to 40. Right. So it's a little bit trickier. But who are maybe some of the names that you could see them more comfortable with dealing? Because there could be two of that player in the system. They could be blocked in the Mets system for a long time, or maybe just not a fit anymore.
I mean, we've talked about Kevin Parada on this show, and he's actually been playing better of late over the last month. His numbers have started to tick up. He's hitting for some power, so maybe that's on more of the higher end of what they might be willing to deal. A guy like Mike Vassell or Dom Hamill, with the way the starting pitching depth looks like for the Mets right now, could they stand to part with one of those guys in the right deal? I think that's possible. And then I think a lot of it, especially when you're dealing with these kind of relievers, I think you're going to want to look down in like St. Lucie and the complex league. And, you know, a lot of these relievers, these teams know they're not going to get a very good, close to major league ready prospect for them. I mean, just think back to David Robertson last deadline with the Mets. Obviously, he was one of the top relievers available on the market. And the Mets got two guys with upside in Marco Vargas and Ronald Hernandez, but they were in the complex league rookie ball, and teams are much more willing to take the risk of losing a guy like that versus, you know, someone that's much closer to the big. So I would say definitely take the time to peruse the Brooklyn roster, the St. Lucie roster, the Florida complex league roster. And I think those are probably the main areas where they would look to deal with a guy like Parada or Vassell or Hamill, maybe being options if they want to make something with a little more impact where teams would want something a little closer to big league ready.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think when you look at it from that perspective, you're trying to empty as little as possible from the farm system while also understanding it's your duty at the end of the day to make this team a little better now. And that's why we talk about the balance of trying to make it more than just now, but finding maybe somebody that can give you some help next year. It's getting ahead on the business that you need to do in the winter, which is going to be a very, very long list. All right, so next Tuesday night after the MLB trade deadline, we will be live. We don't know when that exact time is for sure right now, but most likely it'll be after any potential news conference from David Stearns. That's typically how we operate with the Mets pod. We wait to hear from whether it's, a big moment from the manager, the front office, whoever it may be, Steve Cohen, and then we react because we'll have actual quotes to react to. So if you subscribe, you'll never miss a show. But if you want to watch us live, keep an eye out for that on all SNY social platforms, especially the YouTube channel, because you could subscribe there and get alerts there and know when the Mets pod is live. And you're listening to the Mets pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Of course, you can watch on SNY's YouTube channel, as we said, or wherever you get your podcast. All right, time to jump into the scoreboard, Joe. Nothing to recap from last week. Thank God. I'm tired of recapping these where I lose every week. And I'll sadly remind everybody of the score here because, Joe, it says in the rundown that you are my Marlins. I think that's disrespectful to you.
It's a backhanded compliment, but
it is. That's just saying that you're my kryptonite, but you're not really good against anyone else.
But at the same time, I love whenever our producer Jeff decides to make a dig at you in our rundown. Oh, yeah. I'll take it and run. But yes, it is maybe the backhanded compliment of the century.
So you are up 38-30. Now, my glass half full of this is, I think this time last year, I'd be very surprised if I had 30 points or even close to it. I felt like last year I would scrap together just to get a category right. This week you've had some really big weeks, and I've kind of been, hovering around 500 sometimes here or there, or maybe a little bit below that. All right, so for this week, 8 games, massive week, because we have the deadline show, which is a little later than our typical recording time. So this is kind of a fun one that we get 8 games here. 1 against the Marlins, 2 against the Yankees at Yankee Stadium, 4 against the Braves, who before this Marlins series, the Mets are creeping up on that Braves team that they're limping at the moment. 1 against the Twins. Over under push is set at 2, Joe. For how many trades will the Mets make before the deadline? So let's specify if they do a trade where they get an outfielder and a reliever from the same team in the same package, that is one trade.
Right.
So let's just make sure we make that clear. This isn't players acquired, but total trades. What do you like here?
I'm gonna push. I have this kind of gut feeling that they're gonna find the way to get, like you said, an outfielder and a reliever in one deal, and then trade for a reliever in another deal. And so I'll push. I'll say 2, and I think there's a chance maybe for 3, depending on what happens with a Jose Quintana or someone like that from the rotation. But I'll push for the sake of this.
I'll go over on this one. I'm with you. It feels like it's a sweet spot between 2 and 3 because of that potential package deal for the Mets. And I can't see it being more than 3. I'll say that there's just only so much room on the roster. They're not trying to gut and retool this thing completely. They're trying to, kind of add around just a sprinkle here or there. But I think if you factor in the 2 relievers and an outfielder, it can get them to 3, not even factoring, like you said, Joe. There could be a player internally that they move that catches our eye a little bit. Yes or no, will Christian Scott get his first major league win? I'm going to say yes, Joe, because this just has to turn at some point. Now, this is what I would call bad betting, because every trend tells you that the answer is no, because Scott does not work deep into games, and Scott has been vulnerable to the home run ball, which is a recipe to not win ball games as a starting pitcher. If you give up the home run, you could still win if you go 6 or 7 innings. But when you go 4 to 5 innings and give up the home run, it's very tough to win. But this just feels like before this little stretch, he was running into a lot of bad luck, and he's kind of bound to get back to the mean a little bit here. And the Mets are very due for an offensive explosion in one of these games this week. So I'm going to go yes for Christian Scott to finally get, this giant chip off his back right now and get the win.
I'm going to continue to chase my losses, which is also bad betting advice. I'm going to keep chasing this, and I'm going to say it now. I'm saying yes to this Christian Scott thing every week it is on, because one of these weeks I will be right. So I will say yes, and I will keep riding it until yes happens.
Yeah, I mean, at some point it just has to trend. I'm trying to think of was it Eichhoff? Who is the pitcher they used to throw out there and he would give up like 10 runs? This was maybe
Jared Eichhoff. Jared Eichhoff had a tendency to do that.
Jared Eichhoff is who I'm thinking of. He's not Jared Eichhoff, where I need to pull up Eichhoff's ERA with the Mets that year. It was really tough. This is 2021. He started 4 games and he had an 8.69 ERA. Like they threw him out there 4 times and he got clobbered. It's not Jared Eichhoff, okay? Like I want to make this. That's why you consistently go with that it has to turn. All right, Subway Series, Joe. This is just simple. Mets sweep, Yankees sweep, or a split.
I'm gonna go split, like I did when we were live at Citi Field for that one. The pitching matchups, again, theoretically, are in the Yankees' favor. The Mets obviously clobbered both Cole and Luis Gil at Citi Field. They're facing both of them again.
That's good.
Maybe it's a good thing, but I don't think that's going to repeat. So I'll say split. We definitely don't want a Yankees sweep, so I won't pick that.
It is funny to say that that's good since they've pitched against the Mets, like Gil is a guy that's been pretty good. I mean, his 3 starts since pitching against the Mets, he's gone 6 innings, 1 run, 6 2/3, 1 run, 4 innings, 4 runs against the Reds. And Cole's really bounced back his last 2 starts. I think he's gone 6 innings and gotten
that was inevitable.
Yeah. So, and you look at everyone else in that rotation, you'd be dying to get a chance at Nestor or Rodon now. And I'm sure there's something about the Mets that would love to see Marcus Stroman, but that's another conversation for another day. I'm going to go with the split as well. Part of me, from a betting angle, wanted to take Yankees sweep because of our theory that these teams always split as a whole, and the Mets already won 2 games against the Yankees. So it feels like they're bound to just be 2-2 on the season. But I think they split this series because the Mets have been playing just much better baseball for a long time right now, even with this little run against the Marlins. I think it's 1-1 in the Bronx. All right, over-under pushes at 2 for Pete Alonso home runs. This is infuriating at this point. Now, it's 8 games, Joe. I'm going to push here for Pete home runs. I had been very optimistic with Pete because he's one of those guys that when he starts to hit the long ball, he hits 3 in a week. But I don't. It's just how many times. It's not the Christian Scott thing where I just have to keep pressing the button and saying yes to it. I'll go with a push here for Pete. He traditionally performs well against both the Marlins and the Yankees. They got 4 against the Braves, who their rotation is just absolutely destroyed right now. We saw Fried just go on the IL with a forearm injury. Morton hasn't been good this year. Strider's out for the year. I think Pete has 2 home runs in these 8 games, Joe.
It's been really tough watching Pete in July. It's been a struggle for him, especially with runners in scoring position. It feels like, I know he said he's not pressing, but it sure as heck looks like he's pressing to me. But I will try to be positive here because I do think that home run stretch has to come at some point. And I have 8 games. When are we going to have an 8-game week again here on the scoreboard? I don't know. So I'll go over and say Pete will hit 3 home runs. And, I don't feel overly confident in it, but, he's talking a lot about, starting to see the ball better and feels good. So hopefully that home run stretch happens here this week as the Mets need to string together a couple wins heading into the deadline.
Over under pushed at 2 for Mark Vientos home runs. Joe, it's been a week where Vientos is not hitting the ball very hard, and it's been somewhat effective, but Vientos is a guy that it's not a matter of if. Eventually, he's going to make hard contact and get a hold of something.
I'm going to go under while he could easily blow past 1 home run. The thing that I've liked from Mark Vientos is, he hasn't hit the ball incredibly hard the last few days, but he's generally hitting the ball hard, but he's focusing on line drives. He's not trying to put the ball into the second deck. He's spraying liners gap to gap, and he's so strong that some of them just go. That's the way it's going to work. But I'll go under for Vientos home runs, but that's not a slight to what I think Vientos can do.
I mean, to your point, that's why Vientos is hitting 292 and has an 887 OPS. Like, he's one of the most effective hitters on the team because his understanding of what he doesn't have to do anymore. And I think we've seen him and Alvarez kind of mature in that way. I'm going to push for Vientos. 8 games. I could see 2 home runs. He's really due for at least 1. I'll go with the push just like I did with Pete there. Over push is at 4 for Mets starters going at least 6 innings. This is 8 games. They've been much better about this lately, it feels like, especially before the break. I am going to push on this one, Joe. I think in half the games they get 4 innings from they get 4 starts where the Mets starters go at least 6 innings.
I'll push as well. I've been on the high here of being over, and I have a good feeling about tonight with the Marlins. Yankees at Yankee Stadium is just such a hit and miss thing because you could just give up a few fly balls that happen to fly out, and that yanks you out of the game early. But so I'll push, and we'll see how it is next week.
Nicely done, Joe. Yanks you out of the game early at Yankee Stadium. Over under push is at 5 for Mets wins. What do you like here? 8 games. The number's at 5. Pretty high number.
Yeah.
5 against, listen, I understand the Braves are not the Braves right now, but this is a tough stretch, these 8 games.
It is a tough stretch. I will go under. I will say they go 500. I'll see a 4-4 over these 8, and you kind of take that and run, I guess, a little bit because the schedule will open up a little bit at kind of when they get beyond this stretch. So I'll push. Under and say 4-4 for the next 8.
I got to make up some ground on you, so I'll take the push on this one and hope the Mets can find a way to have a winning record in these 8 games with the 5. All right, stay tuned, of course, for next week's scoreboard, which hopefully I'm not down by 8 points. Let's go down on the farm here, Joe. We got draft signings incoming right now. It feels, and you tell me, Joe, it feels like the Mets are confidently getting a lot of their key picks done, which in the Major League Baseball draft is far from a guarantee with this slotting.
Yeah, they're rolling on. Jonathan Santucci, 2nd rounder. Nate Dome, 3rd rounder. They signed. Ryan Lambert in the 8th round. Brenton Gurton in the 10th round. And some beyond round 10 picks have signed. Trey Snyder is the name that a lot of people have sent me posts on Twitter about. You've asked me in text message, what's the deal with him? And it sounds like he'll be in St. Lucie sometime this week. And the expectation that he's going to be signing for a well above slot bonus. And Carson Benz should be coming in here in the coming days as well to sign his deal. So, as in between the madness of the trade deadline, teams have to get these draft picks signed and, ready to start their professional careers. And that is ongoing as we speak.
Yeah, Snyder would be a big one. Just because he was a 5th-round pick, it feels like getting that one done and finding a way. I mean, he's signed on with Tennessee, so that tells you everything you need to know about his raw talent, and one we'll keep updated on the show. All right, let's get to the actual minor leagues, Joe. Drew Gilbert, what's the latest with it? As we've been waiting for Drew Gilbert, this was the guy that we thought could make an impact with the Major League club, and injuries have gotten in his way throughout the entire minor league season so far.
So he's back, he's playing, and the numbers aren't awesome, but he's kind of playing rehab games down in St. Lucie. He did some games with the Complex League, did some games with Low A St. Lucie. I suspect he'll be making his way back to AAA Syracuse here pretty soon. And we talked earlier in the show about acquiring a Jesse Winker or acquiring a different outfielder. If for some reason the Mets are unable to pull that off, ahead of the deadline, if Drew Gilbert makes his way back to Syracuse and performs offensively to the expectations that, I had and the Mets had coming into the season for him, then maybe Drew Gilbert is a guy that can impact this team in the stretch run. Because I thought coming into the season that he would have been the first prospect called up amongst, all of the top prospects within the Mets system. So I do think he's close from, a skill set perspective as far as being major league ready. Now he just needs to go to Syracuse and hit and maybe force the Mets' hand a bit.
All right, and a friendly reminder from our friends at the Brooklyn Cyclones. They are home in Coney Island beginning Tuesday and through the weekend with some great giveaways and events as they always have. So for more details and tickets, visit brooklyncyclones.com. All right, Joe, let's close this thing out with our mailbag segment, as we always do. And as we often do when available, we start with our 5-star review questions from the reviews on Apple Podcasts. So thank you from Chad Bordelon, who said to lead off, a long one, but a fun exercise today. So everybody strap in for this one. I promise you, you're going to want to listen very carefully what Chad has to say. What if the Mets totally change the way pitching is used? Am I crazy? Go to a 6-man rotation, hoping to get 5 innings, but obviously going as deep as normal. But then rather than using multiple relievers, use finishers. Example, Severino goes 6, Budo goes 3. The finishers are starting pitchers that just can't go through the rotation more than twice. Closers finish games when the finishers become ineffective or when no finishers are available due to only having 4. The Mets have a very deep starting pitching crew, and it's crazy to not use them simply because it hasn't been done in the past. Using this also keeps your finishers stretched out to be ready if any of the starters get injured. So the staff, starters that have a goal of 5 innings pitched: Severino, Christian Scott, Kodai Senga, David Peterson, Sean Manaea, Jose Quintana. It's a 6-man rotation. The finishers with a goal to pitch 4 innings or less: Buto, McGill, Lucchesi, and then Hauser. And he also put in parentheses Hamill, Stewart, and Sproat if they get anything from the really, really young guys. The closers, who have goals of 1 innings pitched to kind of relief for the finishers: Edwin Diaz, Nunez, and Maton. Joe, I think this is really interesting. And I think there's obviously ways you could poke holes in it because otherwise it would be done by every team. But I will say I like how structured this is towards the Mets' strengths this year. Like most years, you couldn't even dream of this when you watch the Mets because they could barely have 5 guys to start games. But they are in a very peculiar, unique situation this year that this is far from the craziest thing I've heard. What do you think? Pros and cons.
So one of my favorite lines that he said in that was that it's crazy to not do this just because it hasn't been done in the past. And that is music to my ears. Right. I don't care what was done previously. I want to maximize the possibility for my team to win.
No style points in this game.
No, you just win and you find a way to win. One of the things I'm going to poke holes in is the options on relievers in the bullpen. So, I mean, are you just going to designate for assignment Reed Garrett and Sean Reed Foley and all these guys that you don't have minor league options left? so you can't send him to AAA in place of these finishers. I think the concept is a strong one, and I think the Mets, in a small way, are kind of looking at this when they have the multiple guys with Buto and Hauser both in the bullpen that are, perceived long men. Most teams historically only have one long man, and that's it. Mets have a couple, and Reed Foley's a guy that could go a couple innings and such as he returns. So I think it's probably tough to pull off from just a roster construction standpoint. That would basically require you to have a team in a 40-man roster full of guys that are optionable, because otherwise you're not going to be able to change out these guys. You'll kind of lack depth. But the general concept of starter 5-inning goal, I think, is where the game is headed. So I think that makes a lot of sense, where start, as much as it's going to pain a lot of people, and we grew up watching a different baseball, it's just a different baseball. And you'll get some nights where someone could go 7, which Chad did mention, and maybe there's nights where guys go longer, but targeting 5 I think is reasonable with a 6-man rotation. And if you can start to develop finishers, I think that is where this can really maybe become a thing. And I think we had said this on the show not long ago, that I think the time is not far away where teams are going to start developing long reliever type of guys, just relievers that can go multiple innings, draft starters, and just trim down their innings a couple, but plan for them to be 3 to 4 inning options, as they progress and become major leaguers. So really awesome concept. And Chad, appreciate you taking the time to spell it all out, and really, really well done. I think it's just probably a little tough to pull off from a roster management standpoint, but the idea does make sense to me.
I thought it was fascinating. And I think that while when you read it, and even Chad said it, it seems like mad scientist work to you. I don't think what the Mets are doing, like you said, Joe, is that far away from this. It's almost, this is the exaggerated version of it, because the reality is, and I've thought this for a while, they're looking at Buto and trying to make him their new Seth Lugo, where if Buto's up throwing, I mean, he almost always gives you more than an inning. Almost always. That's and it's not, oh, we're down 8-3 in the 4th. Right. Buto, come in and get us to the 6th inning. It's not like that anymore.
Yeah,
it's
pitch the 6th and 7th, maybe, or the 7th and 8th. Like,
right.
They're willing to put them in high leverage spots. And I think having guys that can go more than 1 inning and be able to pitch in high leverage spots, the more of those you could have, the better overall you'll be set up to get through stretches of games, especially not long ago when they had the 17 and 17, right? 17 games, 17 days. You need guys that are going to give innings, because there's going to be unavailable arms from day to day.
I think the question is, or my poking holes in this is, I think Buto, his success, he's the dream of it. And I think it kind of makes us maybe overvalue or overestimate McGill, Lucchesi, and Hauser. That's my take of it. And maybe McGill, it really works. Maybe it works for Lucchesi. I don't know. And Hauser has had moments, but Hauser is also hittable. Where, Buto is the prime example of this, but this is fun. And this is truly, Chad, this is me poking holes, because I love this idea. And I think this should be the goal long term, in a sense, like Joe said, where is it Buto and 2 guys that you developed within the system, and now you're really cooking, where it's not just Lucchesi and Hauser anymore. It's 3 viable multi-inning relief options that we're a powerhouse now. I think that's where you look at it and go, it's, Quintana gave us 4 today and it wasn't great, and now Lucchesi's in to pitch the next 3, and the Mets lost 9-3. That's the glass half empty look at it of where it can go. It's not as flashy, but I agree. The beauty of it is when you think of it in the light of Severino gave us 6 today, and Buto got us all the way to Diaz. That's the dream. So how do we replicate the Buto bridge? And to Chad's point, not always just the Diaz, because Diaz can't pitch every day, and it's great how good Nunez looks. I think we don't talk about that enough, because he's the guy that's been developed within this system, how good he looks. So All right, we'll do one more question. That was a long one, and it's a
Yeah.
great one. And I think it's something that's not going away. I think how they construct this team, not only at the deadline, but in the offseason, we'll revisit this one. Joe, I'm going to pick one simple question because it's not a yes or no answer from us as much as one is wanted. But in your Twitter replies to, your at PSL the Flushing handle where you post the mailbag every week from Yachtsman, should the Mets trade Pete Alonso? And I picked this question not because it's just, yes, they should, show's over. No, they shouldn't, show's over. I think the Met fan right now, Joe, is not thinking that Pete Alonso is getting traded because he's struggling. I think what the Met fan is wondering is, how do you balance the fact that he's struggling? So does this mean he's going to come back on what is a more realistic extension to the Mets because he didn't have this monster contract year that everybody wants him now? Or is he struggling so badly that the time to get anything for him is now because you're not even interested in re-signing him anymore? Or, Joe, is he more valuable almost as a rental that can Pete just get hot in August and September because he's so due to get hot? We'll see what happens, and then we'll take this thing into the winter, which is probably like 99%. That's the outcome. That's the outcome, is that we don't know if Pete Alonso signed an extension. We're all hoping he gets hot during this stretch run, and we're going to answer these questions in December. But I think it's at least fair. It's a fair discussion at this point, Joe.
I struggle to see how it makes sense for the Mets to trade Pete Alonso at the trade deadline. And, he has been struggling, which we talked about. And, ultimately that is where a lot of Met fans that are going to talk about this, that is where it stems from ultimately. Because if Pete Alonso was hitting like Pete Alonso, there's not a soul out there that is saying, we should trade Pete because we can upgrade here, and you could take Brett Beatty and put him at third base and put Vientos at first. The Mets are not going to be better if they trade Pete Alonso at the deadline. I could say that and that's even with the struggle that he has had. Certainly, in the month of July has been a struggle. And, throughout this season, he's just never had those Pete Alonso stretches that we're used to. But I just don't see any realistic way that the Mets are better if they trade Pete Alonso. And I don't think at this point, with the way he's playing, you're not going to convince someone to give you a top prospect for him either.
I don't think so either.
So are you trading Alonso to help your bullpen? Let me tell you, that is going to be a big old loss in David Stearns' trade checker when we check back in a few months. So to me, as frustrating as it is, I think you have to just ride Pete Alonso. Hope that stretch is coming. I mean, I went over on home runs for this week, so I'm thinking that stretch could happen now. But that stretch needs to come from Pete Alonso for the Mets to get where they want to be. If the Mets trade Pete Alonso, to me, that says they lost to Miami today. They got swept by the Yankees. They got swept by the Braves, and they are waving the flag and they're selling other people, because there's no realistic way, if you want to make the playoffs and make a run here. I don't think there's a realistic scenario that exists where you trade Pete Alonso and you still are good. I just struggle to see it.
Right. I think for me, and I've been frustrated with Pete this year like no other, where it just feels like the big spot keeps finding him, and it's just bad at bats. It's not hitting into bad luck, or he's a guy that's just like sack fly or moving the runners over rather than getting a hit or a home run. It's just at bats where he just is not seeing the ball and he's chasing. But you can't send that message to this clubhouse, Joe. No matter what you think of Pete Alonso, this is a team that plenty of them have played together for a long time. There's guys in that room that have seen Pete have just absolute lights out stretches at the end of the year. They are looking at each other and they don't want to subtract. I know we did can you do a little bit of both? And maybe the Mets do, right? Because David Stearns, I don't think he really cares about feelings. And I think that's how you kind of have to be as a front office executive. But I think there's a difference between not caring about feelings and not caring about the dynamic of a ball club. And trading Pete Alonso, definitely, it's different if you don't sign Pete in the winter rather than trading him now. Trading him now messes with the dynamic of a ball club that thinks they are going to make the playoffs internally. Not signing a guy in the winter and having other moves to make your club better, guys can kind of have the time to sit back and let that marinate and go into a spring training like, okay, this is who we are. You don't get that chance in the middle of a baseball season to go, okay, this is who we are now. You sit there and look around and go, why did we subtract that? How are we going to make up for this? And then in 2 hours, you're playing a game. So I think it's not necessarily an emotional side, but there is a mental aspect of this, of why it won't happen, barring a massive, massive surprise.
It's similar in a way to the Josh Hader situation, which is brought up often, right? Where Milwaukee was smack dab in a wild card spot, and he traded Josh Hader, and long term that trade worked out fine for Milwaukee. So that's not really the point, but it ruined that season. Milwaukee crumbled,
and they were public about it. They didn't even hide it. They basically said that it was going to ruin their season.
And that's Milwaukee. What do you think is going to happen in New York? Yeah, I understand where the frustration lies. And Connor, to your point, no one's more frustrated with Pete Alonso than you. We're on the receiving end of some of those texts. So you're frustrated with Pete Alonso, but at the same time, you can't mess with that dynamic. Like you said, if they trade Pete next Tuesday, they have to play Tuesday night against Minnesota, and who's playing first base, who's playing third base. And now there's questions for Lindor and Nimmo to answer, who have been public that they want the team to add. It's like, hey, you wanted them to add, but they traded Alonso. What do you think? So way too much bad could come of it. And in a way, this feels fantasy baseball like, right? Where it's just like, I could trade Pete and just make it work.
Yeah, I think so. I think if you're going to do anything, and even this is very delicate, you might mess around with throwing in matchup-based scenarios Vientos in the cleanup spot, because it's especially against lefties. That's one where, like, okay, Pete's going to hit fifth today. Pete's going to hit sixth today. And I think he'd be really pissed about it. But I think that's as far as this goes.
That's life.
That's life, and that's not very far at all. And hey, if Pete Alonso needs to get pissed off, then great. Nobody would be happier than when he hits home runs because he's pissed off. So yeah, I don't think he's ultimately moved, and we're going to have some really interesting combos next week. This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. Remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Leave us a review with a question, and we'll look for it for a future mailbag, as we did today. And of course, you can watch the show on SNY's YouTube channel, become a subscriber over there as well, especially if you want to watch our live trade deadline recap, which will be sometime after we think David Stearns will speak, assuming the Mets are pretty busy around the deadline. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll be able to answer your questions in the moment, which we love to do. We'll break down every single move. Joe will be able to tell you about the 28th overall prospect that they traded to get relief help. So he'll talk you off the ledge of why that player in Port St. Lucie isn't going to come back to haunt us, or why he will. So stay tuned there. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.